Welcome to episode 180 of Silver Lining for Learning. I'm Chris Deedy with the Harvard Graduate School of Education. My co-hosts are Punya Mishra from Arizona State University, Kurt Bonk from Indiana University, and Yang Zhao from the University of Melbourne and the University of Kansas. And we are excited to have as our guest today, Manos Antoninis, I'm terrible with names, who's director of the Global Education Monitoring Program at UNESCO. Mary Burns, who has been active in learning technologies across the world for a long time and has valuable perspectives to share about the report. And John Arnold Siena, who is involved in the Southeast Asian region. Each of them will introduce themselves and talk about their role. So the minute that I saw this report, I was excited and I said, we've got to do a Silver Lining for Learning episode about it. And that is in part because, of course, the Southeast Asia region is very important in world affairs. And so zeroing in on technology use in education in that area is of value. But even more, the report seemed to me to be different than the usual report. All of us who are co-hosts have seen a million reports where people say, here's a region, and by gum, we put technology in it. We put in a lot of devices, we put in a lot of internet connections, and everybody's wonderful and happy with technology. And of course, that is, while typical, that's not a good approach, because we know that if we just throw in a lot of devices and internet connections as if technology was magic, it doesn't tend to have much of an impact. So investments that are systemic in technology are important. And I think this report does a really good job of indicating that. But the other thing that I think is even more unusual about this report is it talks about the kinds of second and third order effects of using technology. That technology can widen gaps at times if it's not used well. It can put demands on teachers that can undercut some of what they're doing unless it's used well. And it can raise issues of security, privacy, and intellectual property that are potentially troubling. So as I said, I was really impressed with the report because it seemed to me to be balanced about technology and to think about it systemically. And I'd like each of you to talk about your sense of the report and the kind of role that you played with it. So we'll start with John.
Hi, Chris. Thank you very much. Nice to meet all of you. And thank you very much for inviting Simeo and me particularly, having been assigned by our director to join you tonight in this episode of Silver Lining for Learning. I'm John. I'm Deputy Director for Program and Development at the SEMEO Secretariat. SEMEO stands for Southeast Asian Ministers of Education Organization, and the Secretariat is based in Bangkok. I'm originally from the Philippines, from the Department of Education. So I joined SEMEO Secretariat in February last year, 2023, when the GEM report was being prepared, particularly for Southeast Asian region. So the regional report on education and education technology. It was already in the middle of development, and being the new deputy director, I was assigned to form part of the editorial board. So every now and then, the team of Manos from Paris would refer to us the drafts for us to review, given that this is a regional report for Southeast Asia, and so therefore it would make sense if you have the eye from the Southeast Asian ministers of the education organization to look at it because of the regional nature of the report. So yeah, I think at this point that's my role. Thank you.
Manos.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for the invitation. I think you already presented me. I'm the director of the Global Education Monitoring Report. And if you were pleased and interested with the Southeast Asia edition, I hope you also had the chance to look at the global edition that was published last year. The report is quite an unusual institution. It exists for more than 20 years, and it is established with the mandate to monitor progress on education with respect to the internationally agreed goals. Currently, these are the 2030 goals for sustainable development. But we also have a mandate to monitor the implementation of the policies at the national and international level to help achieve these goals. So we have a board that decides on our theme. So the theme of 2023, which in fact was decided even before the pandemic, was technology as the big holy grail. How can we perhaps apply it to ensure that there is acceleration of progress towards other goals? And that actually was the perspective of the report. That was the one contribution, and maybe that's what attracted your interest. We didn't ask, what are the technologies? How can we apply them? We asked first and foremost, what are the big education challenges we're facing today? And if we can actually formulate those, then we should ask the question, how can we solve them? And is technology one of the potential tools? And that's also how that was reflected in the title of the report, Technology in Education, a Tool on Whose Terms? Since 2019, we have made a consistent effort, given that this is a report for universal goals. We're hosted and published by UNESCO, but we are an editorially independent team to reach out to regions around the world and work with partners to help reach the audiences in different regions, different communities. So in the technology cycle, we have planned two regional editions. The first is the one we're talking today on Southeast Asia with our partners at Simeo, who did much more than what John just described. And we're also planning a second regional edition, which is currently underway on the Pacific. And as you say, we chose these two regions, partly because we haven't covered them before, but also partly because we felt that there is something very interesting to discover. And Southeast Asia is, of course, a part of the world that is very dynamic, therefore is one of those regions which potentially stands ready to apply technologies in education. And that was essentially what triggered this collaboration.
Mary.
Yes, hello everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. My name is Mary Burns. I'm actually based in Portugal at the Escola Superior de Educação de Paula Frasnetti, which is a small teacher training institution here in Porto. I wrote the background paper or the think piece for the Global Education Monitoring Report, as well as a chapter where I interviewed teachers around the globe, including in the Philippines, about their uses of technology. And because I'm very good at criticizing things, Manos brought me to Paris to review the draft. I think more germanely for today, from 2005 to 2019, with the exception of a year and a half, I worked in the Southeast Asia region. Of the 11 countries that the regional report defines as Southeast Asia, I worked in all of them with the exception of Malaysia and Brunei. So I spent a period of 7 years working in Indonesia on technology integration programs for university faculty, teacher educators, as well as teachers, teacher trainers in 5 provinces. This was when I was with Education Development Center. It was a huge USAID project. I spent 5 years working in the Mekong region, Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, with university faculty, helping them change how they teach. They were quite good at using technology. Worked in the Philippines, worked in Singapore, and in 2019 did a needs assessment in April 2019 for the Millennium Challenge Corporation in Timor-Leste, where I looked at the entire education system. So it's a part of the world that I know pretty well. And I have to echo what everyone says. If you're me, who's someone who does the work, designs it, does it, implements it, there's no better place on earth to work because people are so keen to do well, improve, innovate, implement. So thanks for having me.
I know that Kurt has a question, but I just wanted to jump in and say to Manos that anytime you want to bring me to Paris to review a draft, I'm more than happy to volunteer for this.
You have to be really annoying and critical, Chris, to get that invitation.
We just had the first global conference on education data and statistics in Paris, and the participants said there's no better place to have such a conference in the world. It's probably true.
I second Chris's notion. I think we'd make a good tag team on this. Just saying. I don't know. In fact, I don't speak for Punya and Young, but I'm sure all four of us could easily find time in our schedules to show up. And do a Silver Lining for Learning show from Paris. So last night at midnight, I was chatting to an incoming student from Bangkok, John, and I started asking myself, and he started asking me about research possibilities that exist that he might be interested in if he was to coming to our university. So I'll ask you that same kind of question. Given you've done this report, what types of open research questions are out there that you think the young people who are in graduate school right now might want to pursue? We have students in our program from Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and other parts of Southeast Asia. And I'd love to have them come in and say, hey, this is a great report that's just come out. You might think about doing research on, this aspect because there's a huge gap and a huge need, they're fitting a purpose. So if someone's looking for a purpose and wanting to explore within Southeast Asia, given what your report is all about, what are some trends or some gaps? What are some things that you might want to point out, because they might be listening later to this podcast show. They might be watching this in the YouTube channel. There are a lot of young people that contact me who are in graduate school that have listened to the show. So anyone?
Yep. Thank you, Chris, for the question. I think you've mentioned my name, so I jumped in right away. The report for Southeast Asia is quite interesting because while we are saying that education technology can transform education systems, education landscape, but there's still a lot of space for research, especially when we found out that the impact of education technology is mixed, and that in Southeast Asia there is no specific research that would really pin down that it's because of education technology that's impacting and improving learning outcomes. So that is one of the major findings in this report is to look at whether there is a Southeast Asian flavor of research looking into evidence that education technology is indeed working in classrooms in Southeast Asia, especially particularly teaching and learning. So that's really a rich area, I think, for research. The other one, the other area where research can also be can find interesting would be in the area of management, because I think even our education leaders are quite skeptical in terms of how they use technology in aiding education management, data management, even the use of learning management system, assessment, the whole range of things in education. I think Southeast Asia is quite open for a lot of research on education and technology, given the report that has been released. I think Manos has other ideas, I guess.
happy to jump in, Chris, if you'd like me to. So I think from our perspective, and it's of course not surprising, Kurt, that you have so many students from the region. I think the report documents an example that the largest increase in students' enrollment in online, massive open online courses shortly after the pandemic was actually coming from countries like Indonesia or Vietnam. But the one area in which we have routinely found it difficult to come up with solid evidence is the rationale, the reason, the processes, and the evidence that governments use to invest in technology. Singapore stands out. When we had the global report in the introductory chapter, we had 7 country case studies, one from each of what we call SDG regions, the let's say big UN regional groupings. And the subliminal question, it was not explicitly said, but if you read it, you see that is how many countries are actually using evidence to make their decisions, and actually how many countries even invest in the production of evidence to back these decisions. And it was very difficult to find any. I think Singapore might be one of the exceptions globally that does have a systematic approach. But for most countries, we found what essentially, maybe countries only like the United States have, which is there's a federal repository, all the different products that circulate are being placed there, and all the evidence that exists about them is documented. I mean, there has been some interesting background research saying that the federal government's clearinghouse features more than 10,000 products, but only 2% of those have some evidence of moderate or strong impact on learning. Now, this is, of course, a global public good of huge significance, but how can each government have access to such a documentation in order to take the decisions that best serve the interests of students in the country? And in practice, you find very little research on that because it's very, very hard to access. No country is very keen to document what did not go well, which is often the case. What were the mechanisms, the channels, who was influenced by whom to do what type of investment? Even our partners, the EdTech Hub, a global project that is funded by the World Bank, the UK government, and the Gates Foundation, precisely with a focus on opening up a little bit the evidence base on that, struggled very much. And when, the closer you come to a government, the more difficult it becomes for any minister, any official to share precisely the exact story of what happened behind. So that's, I think, a very, very rich area of potential research, more of an operational research, but I think it would be really valuable.
Mary?
Yeah, so Kurt, I think my response would be a lot less about the technology directly and more about the human beings and the system. So to jog my memory for this morning, I got up and I kind of skimmed some of the interviews I did with teachers in Aceh in 2005. And, I just was kind of looking at teacher interviews I've done over the years in Thailand and et cetera, up to 2019 when I was in Timor-Leste. And then in 2022, I interviewed teachers from the Philippines about technology. What's amazing to me is the technology's changed. There's more of it. There's better internet connectivity. The professional development and the integrating technology, the teaching well with technology, it has remained the same. It is the same issue that people raised in the Philippines in 2022, the teachers raised in Timor-Leste in 2019, the people raised with me in Lao PDR in 2015, the Indonesian teachers raised in 2006. And I think a big issue that we don't look at enough is the systems that are responsible for preparing and forming teachers and supporting teachers to really teach well with technology, to use it to support really good learning. Some of that is the pre-service institutions, the FKIPs as they're called in Indonesia. More of them are, with the exception of Singapore, which is really an outlier and has a very flat organizational structure. And it's tiny, it's got just 400 schools. But in the rest of the region, which is so diverse, I mean, it really is about the education system, the district offices, the regional offices, the national offices, which are often tasked with supporting teachers, training teachers, showing teachers best practice. And they often really struggle to do this. And I think it's a tremendously under-researched area that deserves a lot of research, because I think a lot of the struggles can be attributed really to some of this.
So in terms of pedagogy, everyone struggles with that, and we have, new technologies, but it's the pedagogy that's important. And what I've tried to do over the past couple of decades, 3 decades or more, is create frameworks or models for thinking about the use of technology integration. Punya's got one of the most famous model, the TPAC model, that's been cited almost 100,000 times. That's why he's the new AERA fellow. I've built a couple, one called Tech Variety, which is a motivation model. You can get that off my homepage with a free book, and has 10 principles of motivation. I have another model called Read, Reflect, Display, and Do, R2D2. And I'm working on one on critical, creative thinking, cooperative learning, motivation. And but the way the Tech Variety book has a new version that's come out really short from Commonwealth of Learning in Vancouver with a free class on how to motivate students online. So you might want to check it out. All those are available off my homepage. But this week I gave part 2 of a talk on the AI pedagogy, innovative AI pedagogy, and that was recorded. That video is available. You can go to the Contact North site or just contact me. So it's a 2-part talk on generative AI and innovative pedagogy for, instructors. So that's where a lot of people's minds are at right now. And just this is fresh. And so I'm happy to send that to you after Mary, Manos, and John. I'll just shoot you an email.
That'd be great.
Thanks.
All right. So this is, first of all, thank you for joining us today. And so it's a sort of a 2-part question I'm going to ask. So one reason Silver Lining for Learning started was back in March of 2020, when Zhao sent us an email. The COVID pandemic was just starting. And so the first part of the question is, like, what do you see as sort of what has been learned from that experience across the countries that we are talking about? And second, I think, John, you sort of mentioned that as well, which is there is incredible, and I think Mary, you alluded to it as well, which is that there is incredible variability within these countries. So, I mean, if I take any country, you will find even within the country, there is incredible variability in terms of access, in terms of quality of teacher training. The report talks about like issues of equity. So I'm wondering, like, so first part is sort of like what was learned from the COVID pandemic, because that was one sort of push everybody had to take into the sort of the world of ed tech, right? Whether you liked it or not, that's what it was. But there are sort of systemic inequities, other kinds of economic inequities. How has sort of these nations responded to that in going forward? Like, what has been learned from the pandemic, and then how has that impacted work going forward, given the incredible disparities that exist within these societies? So anybody wants to go first, and we'll just go around that way.
Maybe I'll go first. Because this is experience from the Philippines. When COVID struck in 2020, I was still with the Department of Education. So we were like wondering how are we going to transition from face-to-face to online learning. And we thought all the while that that online learning was the way to go. And then when we did our survey, 90% of our students and teachers would prefer printed learning modality, precisely because they did not have any stable internet connection and access to devices as well. And we realized that we could have taken seriously online learning prior to pandemic. In other words, we could have, because we were already working on ICT for education before that. So, but we were hounded by a lot of issues as well. And the plan to sort of push for more computers and internet connection for schools, somehow they were relegated to the background because there are more pressing issues. And in fact, when the pandemic more than 90% of our schools were using printed modules, and only very little fraction of our schools used radio and TV and online learning. Maybe there was some combination also of online with printed modules and with online with TV and radio and so on. So what we realized is that, one, there's we did not realize that that online connectivity was a big issue. Access to technology, to devices was a big issue then. So moving forward, I think the department, before I left, I think the Department of Education in the Philippines, I could speak of the Philippines, but I think this is also an experience in Southeast Asia during the pandemic, that we have to really push for, equipping our schools and preparing our system for pandemics, for disruptions like this. And that is, looking at how technology would be able to help us to be resilient and to be responsive to situations like this. I think that's from my direct experience.
Thank you, John. Mary, Manos?
Yeah, I think what the region has always been very good at, especially the archipelagos like Indonesia and Philippines, is a long history of distance education systems. So Indonesia in the 1950s, I think it's the Teacher Institute of Bandung, started these. Indonesia has 17,000 islands, 6,000 of which are populated. The Philippines has, John, something like 6,000, and 2,000 are populated.
7,000. Yeah.
So, Indonesia and the Philippines have a long history of open and distance learning. So Indonesia with their Universitas Terbuka, of the Philippines with their Open University. Radio has been very long history in the region. Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia in particular, of upgrading teacher skills. So I think what we saw was those legacy technologies, the old technologies, radio, TV, they made a comeback, and the places that had them were able to get learning to more kids, professional development to more teachers. Countries that made investments in digital technologies and online technologies were able to reap those benefits. So Singapore, before the pandemic, actually required kids to have an online course, to take an online course. That really paid off. And Indonesia, its rate of internet access when I was there, when I did a distance ed study for the government in 2009, the internet penetration rate was 6%. Now it's 79%. That doesn't mean most schools have it, but they have, because their internet has grown, the ecosystem around the internet has grown. So there's a lot of digital content in Indonesian. When I was toward the end of my time there was Rumah Belajar, which is this online classroom. So, and then there have since been kind of mimics of that. And so that existed. So kids could log in to, look at these apps and play educational games, et cetera, and get content. And then we saw that the countries that didn't have that, Laos, PDR, Cambodia, Timor-Leste, and again, I can't talk about Malaysia and Brunei. I mean, I think there you really saw the struggles. The majority of kids who are out of school and not getting any education, and an increase in, certifiable learning loss. So I think we saw that investments in technology did pay off because they did allow some kind of continuity in education.
I come last, and I'm also humbled. I come from a country with apparently 2,000 islands, only 130 are inhabited. So it is a very, very important question. There's no doubt that, of course, COVID-19 and school closures, especially in countries like the Philippines, but also other countries in the region, shook up the system. But we were very careful in the report to avoid sliding into the topic of resilience. It's an argument that has come increasingly onto the surface. Many stakeholders are urging countries to invest in technology to make their systems resilient. But I think we have to be careful. I don't know if the audience is familiar. We're talking about, as you said, a very, very diverse region. Singapore is, of course, a bit exceptional. As I mentioned before, it's a city-state. It's an urban environment, densely populated, very, very rich. Other countries don't fall into this category. And we have, as Mary mentioned, other countries that are lower middle income countries. And in the global report, but that of course applies in this case, we also reminded people that we have estimated that low and lower middle income countries are facing an annual $100 billion gap to achieve their national targets, not the global targets, national targets, which are not as ambitious as universalizing access to education or improving quality. But and if one calculates or adds to that very humble investments, like really humble investments in education technology, which would be offline solutions in low-income countries, and just school connectivity and a little bit of investment around that in lower middle-income countries, that would add another 50% to this gap. And we know that this is not substituting. It's not as if you invest in technology, you also save on some of the other costs. No, because countries still lack schools, lack teachers of good quality, lack access to materials. And yet maybe potentially, investment in education technology could help some countries leapfrog in terms of access to better quality materials. But if the overall conditions in the school do not allow this investment to be fully utilized, then really we're still at the stage where every investment is additional, and that raises some issues of I would say even ethical issues. How much can we expect countries to invest in this when sometimes the majority of students lack basic inputs for what we would all agree are elements of a good quality education. So that's a bit of a response to that. Resilience is, I would say, relevant for the island countries in that part of the world, and that's why we would make more of it in our regional report on the Pacific. There are issues of ensuring good quality connection are relevant because, as we just said, access to good distance education modalities beyond the traditional radio and television tools is increasingly very important for countries that have remote populations. We know how expensive it is to train teachers, and we have some evidence that distance education based on online learning and of course also through the various social media can help teachers establish their own community, come closer together, exchange views. I'm sure we're going to talk more about that. But it has to be measured. We have to be very careful not to give the impression to governments that technology is the answer to their biggest problems. It is a tool. They need to prepare themselves, but with reason.
Thank you. Chris, I think, Kurt, you had a comment.
Yeah, just a comment here. For those of you interested in connecting this show to previous shows, we've had a show, episode 28, in the first season of Silver Lining for Learning, MOOCs and Open Education in the Southeast Asia, and New Models, Fresh Ideas, Untold Hope, with the guests in that show were from Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Thailand, including Professor Zuraini Wadi Abbas from Malaysia. She's also worked in other countries. She recently passed away, unfortunately. Tian Balawati, who Mary might know, was the rector of, a dear friend,
UT.
right? Yeah.
UT, yeah.
Right. And so we had her, and we had Melinda Bandalaria from OpenU in the Philippines, as well as Jintavik Glasan and Tapani Tamater from the Thailand Cyber University. So we had that show, and we had a show on East Asia, women leaders with Okwa Lee from Chungbuk National University and Sung Jung from International Christian University in Japan. So we had Korea, Japan, and then China, we had Meifeng Liu from Beijing Normal. So we've had two shows that people might want to look at after they watch this one that were quite engaging, especially in terms of women role models, because that's 7 people who have made a huge difference, all females, and good friends of mine. So just wanted to mention that. And also the point about Indonesia, we're seeing an uptick in Indonesia here. New memos of understanding signed yesterday, in fact, working with folks in Jakarta and other places in Indonesia. So that's one country I'm seeing, a huge influx. A lot of questions are coming from people in that country about, where's the research going? What's been found? People are starting to to become interested in distance learning in a huge way.
Thanks, Kurt. Thanks, guys. This is kind of interesting. And Kurt, I thought you were going to mention the episode from Nepal.
Oh,
Because
that too.
my
Yes.
question really has a lot to do with an imagined solution. Because now when you're talking about putting the technology there, and there's definitely a lot of investment for that. So the technology, the internet connection on those different islands, those things. But my question really has to do with the issue about learning, because again, I think the traditional approach is always try to train teachers, develop course materials, go with the curriculum. We're still doing this very layered, basic to more advanced, all those things. But technically, once you're connected to the internet, you are technically connected to everything. So the reason I mentioned Kurt, the episode from Nepal, you have students taking MOOCs, courses from Harvard, from Yale, from different countries. Those are, 10-year-olds, they're taking that. So technically, if students are able to get online, they have access to, let's say, for example, ChatGPT or Gemini or Bard or all those instant tools in their own language. Technically, they can take college level courses. Technically, they can really learn anything in their own way. So is it a good idea, especially for the newly connected place, to really train teachers, which will take years to do, to really build schools, which will take a lot of investment? Is there a different way to approach this? What do you think? Mary, Manos, John, this is more of a hypothetical discussion. It's nothing to do with anything, this is what we talk on this show. What's possible to rethink about education?
I'm going to answer that question. I'm going to say, yes, it is. The technology is not pedagogy. I mean, mainly in MOOCs, you don't see great pedagogy. You see kind of old wine in new bottles. Yeah, teachers need to see, it might be old thinking, it's what teachers say over and over again. Model for me, help me plan it, help me integrate it with my own students. Give me time to write, to revise, and support me doing that. And excuse me, I just think we have to really honor that. And I think that's been part of the problem, not simply in Southeast Asia, where the technology has changed a lot for a lot of people. And in many places, the pedagogy and the lack of really deep learning has stayed the same. So I just think that's, it may not be the most innovative or modern thing. It might be tremendously old-fashioned, but, human change and human improvement takes a lot of time. So we have to keep at it.
Let me jump on this just to add to this point. I think there are two issues here, and I think Mary alluded to the first one. It depends how we define learning. What is learning? How is learning achieved? And there is a tendency sometimes also with the focus of the research on very specific learning outcomes that we can run an experiment and control it and show that if you teach children for that particular learning outcome, that particular edtech product, you can achieve some outcome. But that's quite a narrow interpretation of what learning is and how learning is achieved. Learning, above everything, is a social process, and it has to respond to the needs of the learners, their contexts, their cultural and social perceptions. And I think there's a tendency with the extrapolating or exporting the, let's say, the experiences of learners in richer countries that have been exposed now for much longer to particular technologies in particular contexts, to assume that that will apply everywhere else in the world. And yes, there's something magical about having access to so much knowledge at the end of your fingertips, and we have all benefited in one way or another. But it's also easy to forget that we're often quite exceptional. We have benefited and been exposed to so many opportunities to understand the outside world. But for many of the learners we're talking here, ultimately access to a MOOC is quite foreign to their context. You could say the linguistic issue is the first. Of course, more and more people learn English, but that even for those who do, having access to particular content that has not been curated, that has not been adjusted to their needs, that is not part of their local culture, does not necessarily lead to the equitable outcomes that we would like to see. It may benefit some very much, but that doesn't mean that it will benefit the majority or even the system as a whole. I mean, I don't want to sound patronizing with that. Nobody means that, nobody says that we should restrict access, but education leaders who are caring about the majority of the learners or the totality of the learners have to take some of these issues very, very carefully into account. There has been this term of digital sovereignty, which I find a bit hard to accept as a term, but there is some value there. You don't want to introduce control, but you also don't want to have unfettered access to everything, because that makes the life of educators very complicated. I mean, they are often, their capacities are limited, and they want some support to be able to use the simplest and most efficient tools to improve their learning and improve the lives of their students.
Yeah, I'm speaking from the perspective of a teacher in ASEAN, in the region. I've been a teacher for 14 years, and it's kind of difficult to think outside of, how we teachers interact with students, and at the same time believing that schooling is also a social process. So, I mean, for me, maybe as a teacher, I'd like to see how my skills as a teacher is honed to be able to also take advantage of technology that's available for the students and available for the teachers, and let the teachers also take some sort of leadership in terms of how to engage learners in the learning process. So, I mean, allowing students to have access to that's fine, right? I mean, I think there's value as well in students having access to a lot of resources outside of the schooling system. But I think as a teacher, there's so much that we can still, gain from having a more formal interaction with students within the bounds of, let us say, a formal curriculum experience. Eventually all of these, I mean, I think it's going to be part of my learning process as a teacher, and recognizing the potential of MOOCs, for instance, or other forms of learning and resources that students can access. But I think right now it's kind of difficult for me to imagine how, as a teacher, I would have, I think this is the challenge of being a teacher in this era, where you have a lot of competition, and how you make yourself relevant and how you make yourself valuable to the students on their day-to-day experience as learners.
Thank you. I just want to add one point. It's very interesting. Where internet is not available, everybody's trying to wire their students. Where internet is easily available with pads, with smartphones, everybody's trying to lock them up. If you go to many different countries are trying to say, no smartphones, no, it's just really ironic. You guys that making those education technology plans, we want to think about it. Maybe you should limit, no use of internet. It's this is just it's a very unsettling environment in the world. There are many countries, for example, China, France, and there are many school districts bans the use of smart devices. Why do they do that? So anyway, this is kind of funny. Thank you, guys.
So I wanted to introduce the theme of economic development as it's tied to investments in educational technology, because this has been a theme over the decades that in many cases has been persuasive to global South countries. The idea that you're making an investment that can have economic returns that go beyond simply helping students to learn. And in recent shows, some of that has become more specific. We recently did an episode on the Middle East, for example, and another episode on the North Africa. And the big theme was how many youth are graduating from education and find no jobs are available to take advantage of that education. And that's causing a lot of political instability in those countries. And so people are looking at the ed tech investment and saying somehow, not only do we want to help learning in general, but somehow we want to help economic growth and prepare youth for the sectors in which economic growth is possible for our country. So I don't know the extent to which that came up in either the Southeast Asian report or in the global report, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on this issue.
Happy to jump on that. Would not explicitly say that, but I have a response on this question. Countries indeed are competing with each other also on the basis of the quality of their education systems, and of course the cross-national international assessments have helped make that competition stronger. We, of course, had most recently the latest round of results. There were two major cross-national assessments, PEARLS, which is an assessment of reading at grade 4, and PISA, which is an assessment of reading, mathematics, and science for 15-year-olds. And there was a lot of interest, of course, on what was the impact of COVID. And indeed, in some countries, quite a large number of countries, the results went down. But there's also another way of looking at the results. And the result says that actually they went down, but surprisingly not by too much, which could be actually held to be an example of a good impact of technology, because without distance education, it would have been even more difficult to prevent the further slide of these results. But if you look at the trend since 2012, in fact, the results in 2022 were not exceptional in the sense that they established a declining trend in the learning outcomes in the world's richest countries for now 10 years. And of course, the search started, what are these systemic factors that actually explain this long-term decline? And unfortunately, technology is one of the factors that has not been excluded from that potential examination. Of course, it's very difficult to evaluate these systemic long-term trends, global trends. But PISA's reports document, among other things, that when there is excessive access to technology and is not being used for learning purposes, which is of course very common, and many learners, particularly more disadvantaged learners, are very vulnerable to the fact that there is excessive screen time, the fact that is distraction, the fact that time is wasted in other activities, has a long-term impact. The fact there's no reading of the kind that we want. So I would say an emphasis on linking technology and investment and improved education outcomes may be a little bit misleading, and maybe to respond also to your Young's comment. The report traditionally has been a report for what we used to call developing countries, although that's less relevant in the universal agenda. But for the first time, the global report attracted interest from richer countries. And we found ourselves being called to testify in the UK Parliament, in the German Parliament, having meetings with ministers in the Nordic countries. We received last week a message of gratitude from the Prime Minister of one of the 3 Belgian communities, saying how the report influenced their thinking. And in that report, we did not issue an explicit recommendation saying ban phones, but we documented that already 1 in 4 countries, either through their laws or their policies, are reducing access to phones and screens in schools and classrooms. And so we are just documented, but then a big UK newspaper took that, gave it a spin, and suggested we were recommending a ban. We did not, because every country has its own needs. Not every student is the same, but there's definitely a concern about the long-term impact of technology on learning. And that is, I think, an alarm call for technology providers to think much more deeply whether actually they are really trying to improve education, or whether education is being used by technology providers for other means. And that's something we should be quite careful about.
Mm. I think there's 2 issues, Chris, that you bring up, and one is the economic one, and that it is, I mean, I've read this in several places, that probably The Economist, that investing in internet, is when countries invest in internet, it actually does help with their economic development. And, you know, I always think about Indonesia as a case study for that. When I was working there in the mid-2000s, there was such poor internet access and low internet penetration that it really, when the government wanted to launch this kind of distance education strategy for teachers to upgrade their skills from 2 years to what was then an S1 degree, a bachelor's degree, they wanted to do it through online learning. So I did this study, and what you really saw is, because the internet penetration was so low, you really had kind of diseconomies of scale. You don't have digital content, you don't have people with the skills, et cetera. And when you flip that and you increase your internet access, and Indonesia's proof of this in the last decade or so, you get these economies of scale. You get more digital content, you get people with better skills, you get more research. A lot more Indonesians are doing research on technology right now. So that's the first point. I think the second point, and you mentioned North Africa and the Middle East region, but this is very true in Southeast Asia, especially in Laos, PDR, and Cambodia, which are post-conflict societies, Timor, and also Indonesia and the Philippines, is this is a part of the globe with a really high student dropout rate, specifically boys. And the reason they can't get jobs is because they're not educated and they don't have any skills. And you are going to need, and those education systems are already severely burdened. And remember that some of these countries have conflict. So you have a lot of internal migration. And you have external, you know, if you have Burmese refugees in Myanmar, you have, in Thailand, you have Vietnamese refugees in Cambodia. I mean, so there's quite a lot of human movement there. And a lot of these education systems are already kind of at their breaking point. They can't take on, you know, kids who are coming back into the system. And that's why you're going to need technology. The Philippines is a great example of this. They have an alternative learning system. It's for essentially boys that have dropped out of school, to get them back into the system, to get them some kind of an education. It would be the equivalent of a GED in the United States, but they're doing it primarily through technology, because they can only do it through technology without burdening the system. And that's really an argument, again, for, you know, for having internet infrastructure and for having technical infrastructure.
Looking at the report, at least for the Southeast Asia, I think it's consistent that across the countries, there are national policies and strategic plan on technology and education. In other words, these countries are committing to invest, and knowing, I think they have recognized the potential of technology in, well, one, upskilling, reskilling people, such that they would be able to contribute to and leverage technology and contribute to economic development. I think the only concern is that while there are policies, sometimes the resources are not there. We have seen how technology has, in technology and education, investments in technology and education has sort of addressed access, inclusion issues. Although, of course, there are disparities. How we are looking at with mixed results, how technology would be able to improve learning outcomes. and generate efficiencies as well. There again mixed results, but I think across Southeast Asia, the intent is there. It's just a matter of making sure that the investment is put in the right places and that they are used maximally such that it will result in the outcomes that we are actually hoping to achieve. So in fact, a lot of the plans are looking at investments in technology as something that will contribute to economic development through manpower development.
So Kurt, do you
Yeah.
have just a few minutes for one more focused question?
Yep, and I'll mention that the episode with East Asia was 52. The one with Bhutan we had, or with Nepal was 33, and we also had one with Nepal and Papua New Guinea. So we've got shows that connect.
Wow.
My question relates to what all three of you just talked about, is trying to help those that normally didn't have access to education. And in your report, at least in the blog post, it mentions 3 million of those learners were using Coursera. And the Nepal show that we had, the kids were getting financial aid to learn through Coursera. So is that happening extensively? Are the 3 million people that are mentioned in the report all getting financial aid? Or how are those that don't have a lot of economic resources accessing such massive open online classes or other free and open online classes? Do you have any indications or any data or something you might want to mention?
We don't have evidence of that, and I don't think that's likely to be a common occurrence, receiving support for that. I think, and as we close the program, I think the message of the report, if I could summarize it, is that we tried to emphasize that when governments invest in education technology, they need to answer 4 questions. And that partly answers also your question, Kurt. Is the application of the education technology appropriate? That means, is it relevant in improving learning for the context of the students? Secondly, is it equitable? And we often see that some of the choices are not the most equitable and not put the priorities for the most disadvantaged learners first. Third, is it scalable? I think it's important to remember that many of the experiments that we have are based on relatively small scale activities, and we don't know whether how that applies at the overall total system level. And finally, is it sustainable? And by that, we mean not only economically sustainable, but also socially. And we didn't even cover some of the social implications, but also environmentally, which is a growing concern for that. But I will stop here.
Thank you. I think we're going to have to introduce the next show, but I'll be sending you, we have a publication on the Nepal. I've studied it actually and just come out, and we have another one in press. So I'll be sending you guys an email on that.
Thanks.
So you've been listening to episode 180 of Silver Lining for Learning. We really want to thank you for joining us. All 4 of us as co-hosts want to especially thank our 3 guests. This has been a very interesting show and an important show. People from other regions around the world may want to look at the kinds of models that have been discussed in this show. And also all of us should look at the larger global report coming out of this work. So interesting times for everyone. Yang, would you talk about what episode 181 is going to look like?
Well, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Mary. Thanks, Manos and John, for joining us. It was wonderful to always hear about this massively growing fast area, Southeast Asia. It's so thank you very much. As many of you know, our show is called Silver Lining for Learning. So we are particularly interested in educational innovations. We've been following students, about if you give students power, what can they do? So a few episodes ago, we featured students from the US. And last week, we featured students from China, Beijing, Chongqing. Next week, we're going to feature students and teachers from South Australia. So we're going to South Australia. And this is a school that has engaged in a project called HIP, Human Interdependence Project, which tries to enable students to create products to feature how human beings are interconnected. And so we're going to have 2 teachers and students from University College in Adelaide or South Australia. Thank you very much. See you next week.